I always thought I knew my family, but all it took was one question at dinner to shatter that illusion forever. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 31 years old, living in Portland and running a small design business that's been hanging on by a thread since the pandemic hit. Most days I remind myself to breathe, to keep going, to not let the fear of bills piling up choke me. I never told my parents how hard it's been. I only told my grandmother Lydia. Grandma Lydia is 79 and built her own real estate company with my grandfather before he passed away. She's the type of woman who can walk into any room and make it feel like she owns it, not because of her money, but because of the way she carries herself, calm and strong. She's the one person who's always told me to follow my dreams, even when I could barely pay rent. My mom, Carol, is 58 and nothing like Grandma. She's always been obsessed with keeping up appearances, making sure the neighbors think we're the perfect family. She's the type to judge you for wearing the same shoes too many times or for driving an older car, even if it still runs fine. Dad, Robert, 60, just sits quietly in the corner, letting Mom take the lead on everything. I don't know if he agrees with her or if he's just too tired to fight. And then there's Ryan, my 35-year-old brother who works in finance, and Sophie, my 26-year-old sister, still trying to finish grad school. We don't talk about feelings in this family, especially not about money. Everyone has their own way of dealing with Grandma Lydia. Ryan keeps his distance, busy with work and pretending he doesn't need help from anyone. Sophie is polite, but there's always this tension in her shoulders whenever Grandma visits, like she's bracing for something. I used to have someone I could lean on, Adam, my ex. But when my finances started falling apart, so did we. He said he couldn't handle my stress, that I needed to figure out my own life before we could have a future. Maybe he was right, but it still hurt. So when Mom called and said we were having a family dinner, something about her voice made my stomach twist. It wasn't just the forced cheerfulness or the way she said, "It's just a small family dinner. Emily, nothing fancy." It was the way she paused, like she was checking if I would question it. I didn't. I never do. But when I pulled up to their house that Sunday evening, I knew something was off. The new landscaping in the front yard was the first sign. My parents had never spent money on anything they couldn't do themselves yet. Here were trimmed hedges, fresh mulch, and lights lining the walkway. Then I saw the new SUV parked in the driveway, shining under the streetlights. My dad had always driven the same old sedan for years, saying there was no need to waste money on something flashy. I stood there for a moment, staring at the reflection of myself in the car window, wondering how they could afford it when nothing in their income had changed. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her smile too wide, her eyes too bright. "Emily, you're here," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt stiff, like she was hugging a stranger she needed to impress. The smell of roast beef and garlic butter hit me as I stepped inside. The living room looked different too, with a new couch that still had that fake leather smell, a glass coffee table that probably cost more than my rent, and curtains that were definitely not the ones I remembered. "Wow, the house looks nice," I managed. "Just a few upgrades," Mom said, quickly brushing a non-existent crumb from the counter. "You know it was time." Dad appeared from the kitchen holding a glass of wine, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something in his look, something like guilt, before he quickly turned away. Ryan arrived next, barely saying hello before pouring himself a drink. Sophie came last, eyes on her phone, thumbs flying, barely glancing at me as she muttered hi. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Mom kept fussing over the table, straightening napkins that were already perfect. Dad hovered, pretending to check the oven timer. Ryan drained his glass faster than usual, and Sophie kept tapping her phone, her knee bouncing under the table. I sat down, trying to breathe, trying to convince myself that it was just another family dinner. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Mom kept moving around the kitchen, her voice high and cheerful as she talked about the new neighbors who just moved in across the street. I could see the way her hands were shaking as she placed dishes on the table, pretending not to notice how quiet the rest of us were. Dad kept checking the oven even though the timer hadn't beeped, wiping his hands on a towel that didn't need to be cleaned. I caught him glancing at Mom, and for a second I saw fear in his eyes before he turned away. Ryan cleared his throat and said, "Work's been busy," then went back to staring into his drink. His foot tapped against the chair leg in a rhythm that matched the ticking of the kitchen clock. Sophie put her phone down long enough to help set the silverware, her eyes darting between Mom and Dad, then back to her phone whenever she thought no one was looking. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else but here. The house was too quiet. The only sounds were the clink of silverware and the soft hum of the dishwasher in the background. I tried to start a conversation asking about Sophie's classes, but she just nodded, mumbled something about a paper, and looked away. Mom finally announced that dinner was ready, and we all moved to the table like we were actors in a play we didn't want to perform in. The table was set with a fancy tablecloth, crystal glasses, and expensive-looking plates that I didn't recognize. I sat down, my stomach tight, my hands cold around the stem of the wine glass Dad handed me. Mom took her seat at one end of the table, Dad at the other, and for a moment there was silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that made your skin crawl like the air before a storm. Grandma Lydia arrived right on time, stepping through the front door with the same calm presence she always carried. She wore a navy dress, a pearl necklace, her silver hair pinned neatly. She smelled like lavender and old books, and when she hugged me, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. "Emily, darling," she said, squeezing my hand, "you look tired." I managed to smile. "Work's been busy," I said, echoing Ryan's words, even though we both knew it wasn't just work that was draining me. Lydia's eyes softened, but she didn't push. She never did. She greeted everyone else with polite nods, but I could see Mom's jaw tighten when Lydia complimented the table setting. Dad stood awkwardly, trying to smile, failing. We all took our seats, the tension pulling tighter around us as we began to eat. The food was good, but I barely tasted it. Every bite felt heavy, and the clatter of forks on plates seemed too loud in the quiet room. Mom kept talking about the new grocery store down the street, about how the neighbors admired the new car, about how much work the garden took. No one was really listening. Dad nodded at the right moments. Ryan took another drink. Sophie scrolled her phone under the table. I could feel Lydia's eyes on me, studying me as I pushed the asparagus around my plate. "How's the business, Emily?" she finally asked, her voice calm but firm. Before I could answer, Mom jumped in. "She's doing just fine, Mother. We don't need to talk about work at dinner." Lydia didn't look at Mom. She kept her eyes on me, waiting. "It's been slow," I admitted, my voice low. "I'm trying to pick up new clients." Mom's fork clattered against her plate. "Emily, we agreed you wouldn't bring this up." Lydia's eyebrow arched. The only sign of the storm I knew was brewing beneath her calm exterior. "I was asking Emily Carroll," Lydia said, her voice still soft but her words sharp enough to cut glass. The room went silent again, and I felt everyone's eyes flicker between Lydia and Mom. Sophie looked up from her phone, her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but then she looked down again. Ryan drained his glass and poured another. I took a sip of wine, trying to steady my hands. Mom cleared her throat, forced a laugh. "Well, I think we could all use a bit more wine, don't you?" But no one laughed with her. That's when I realized something was coming, something big enough to break this family in half. If you were sitting at that table with me, what would you have done? Have you ever felt tension so heavy it filled every breath you took? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Dinner started with candlelight, expensive wine, and forced smiles that hurt to look at. I could smell the garlic butter and rosemary before I even stepped through the door, a smell so warm it almost made me believe everything would be fine. But when I saw the new chandelier glittering above the dining table and the SUV parked outside, I felt something twist in my chest. Mom had always been frugal, the kind of woman who would buy off-brand cereal and clip coupons, insisting we didn't need anything fancy. So seeing the remodel, the marble countertops, the sleek new appliances, the designer chairs, it all felt wrong. Dad hovered near the kitchen, wiping down a counter that was already clean, nodding too quickly whenever Mom spoke. Ryan stood in the corner with a glass of scotch, swirling it in slow circles, his jaw tight. Sophie barely looked up from her phone, her thumbs flying as if her life depended on it. I sat down at the table, watching the flicker of candlelight dance across the wine glasses, trying to ignore the pit in my stomach. Mom's smile was stretched too thin as she poured wine into my glass. "It's a special night," she said, her voice too bright. "We're celebrating family." Dad coughed and looked away, pretending to adjust his glasses. Ryan downed half of his drink in one gulp and poured himself another, not bothering to use the coaster Mom had placed in front of him. Sophie sighed, set her phone down, then picked it up again when she thought Mom wasn't looking. I tried to clear the tension with a joke saying, "So did you two win the lottery or what?" gesturing toward the new kitchen. Mom froze for a second then forced a laugh. "We've just been managing well." Dad's eyes darted to her then away, his fingers drumming lightly against the glass in front of him. The doorbell rang sharp and clear, cutting through the tension. Mom jumped, smoothing down her dress, forcing another smile. "Let me get that," she said, already halfway to the door. I heard the familiar sound of heels on hardwood and the soft, calm voice of my grandmother as she stepped inside. "Carol, Grandma Lydia," said, her tone polite but cool. "Mother," Mom replied, stepping aside. Then Grandma Lydia walked in and it was like the entire house shifted around her. Her presence was steady, confident, the kind of quiet strength that made you sit straighter without realizing it. She wore a dark green dress, her pearl necklace resting against her collarbone, her silver hair pinned back. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes softening. "Emily," she said, reaching out to take my hand. "You look tired." I hugged her, letting the warmth of her lavender scent ground me for a moment. "I'm okay, Grandma," I lied. She nodded once, her eyes telling me she didn't believe it but wasn't going to push. She moved to greet Ryan with a kiss on the cheek, and he managed a tight smile. Sophie put her phone down long enough to hug Grandma quickly before picking it back up. Mom guided Grandma to the seat at the head of the table, the spot that used to belong to Grandpa before he passed. Grandma sat down slowly, her eyes moving around the table, taking in the new furniture, the fresh flowers, the expensive wine. "What a beautiful setup, Carol," Grandma said, her voice even. Mom's smile flickered. "Thank you, Mother. We just thought it was time to update a few things." Grandma's eyebrow arched slightly, but she didn't say anything else. We all sat, the clink of glasses and the shuffle of chairs the only sounds in the room. The candles flickered, casting shadows on the walls, making the room feel both too bright and too dark at the same time. Mom started talking about the neighbors, about the new store that opened down the street, about the fundraiser she was helping organize at church. Her words were rushed, her hands moving as she spoke, her eyes darting to Dad every few sentences. Dad nodded, adding a quiet here and there, never looking directly at Grandma. Ryan poured another drink. Sophie scrolled through her phone, pretending to listen. I sat there, picking at the edge of my napkin, watching Grandma watch everyone. Her eyes were sharp, moving from Mom to Dad, then to Ryan, then to Sophie, then finally to me. And in that moment I realized Grandma Lydia wasn't just here for dinner. She was waiting for something. Grandma's eyes moved around the table, slow and deliberate, and I could feel the way Mom stiffened under her gaze. Dad cleared his throat and reached for the wine bottle, filling Grandma's glass before she even asked, trying to look useful. Ryan's foot tapped against the floor as he finished his drink, and Sophie's phone buzzed quietly in her hand. We started eating. The only sounds were the clink of forks on plates and the soft hum of the refrigerator. The roast was good, the kind that melted in your mouth, but I could barely taste it. Mom kept talking, her voice too loud in the quiet room. "Mother, did I tell you about the garden club fundraiser?" Mom asked, forcing a smile as she picked up her wine glass. "No, Carol, you haven't," Grandma said, taking a small sip, her eyes never leaving Mom's face. Mom launched into a story about hosting a luncheon for the club, how the neighbors had commented on the remodel, how everyone admired her taste. I watched her hands flutter around as she spoke, her wedding ring catching the light, flashing like a warning. Grandma nodded politely, but I could tell she wasn't listening. She was waiting. "Emily, you should join the club, you know," Mom said, suddenly turning to me. "It would be good for you to meet people, get your name out there for your business." "I don't think a garden club is going to help me find clients, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Mom's smile tightened and she looked away, picking up her fork again. Ryan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, Mom, I'm sure Emily has better things to do." Mom shot him a look, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Ryan, that's enough." Ryan raised his glass, his eyes hard. "Just saying." Sophie's phone buzzed again and she glanced down, her thumbs moving quickly across the screen. Sophie put the phone away during dinner, Mom snapped, her voice sharp. "I'm finishing something for class," Sophie mumbled, not looking up. "It can wait," Mom said, her voice rising. Sophie's eyes lifted, her jaw set. "No, it can't." The tension in the room tightened like a rope pulling around all of us. I could see the way Mom's face flushed, the way Dad's eyes dropped to his plate, the way Ryan rolled his eyes and took another drink. Grandma set her fork down, the sound of it hitting the plate louder than it should have been. "Carol, let her be," Grandma said softly, but there was an edge to her voice that made Mom freeze. Mom opened her mouth, then closed it, her face pale. I glanced at Grandma and she met my eyes for a moment, giving me the smallest nod as if to say she saw everything, every crack in this perfect dinner. It was then that a memory hit me, a flash of Mom and Grandma arguing in our old kitchen years ago. I was 15, sitting on the stairs, listening as Mom yelled, "You think you're better than me because you made your money, because you built your company with Dad. You don't know what it's like to have to keep up, to have people look at you like you're nothing." Grandma's voice was calm, but I remember how cold it sounded. "No, Carol, I don't know what it's like to care so much about what other people think." Mom's voice cracked. "I'm tired of living in your shadow." And now, all these years later, I saw it again, the way Mom's shoulders tensed when Grandma spoke, the way her eyes flickered with something like fear before she looked away. Grandma picked up her glass, taking a slow sip as she looked around the table. The room felt too quiet, too bright, the air heavy with all the things no one wanted to say. Then Grandma's eyes settled on me, sharp and clear, and I felt my breath catch. In that moment, I knew she was waiting for the right moment, for the right question, the one that would tear this perfect dinner apart. Have you ever felt that moment when you know everything is about to change? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Everything changed because of one simple question, but no one at that table was ready for the answer. Mom was talking about the neighbor's new landscaping, her voice high and too cheerful as she moved her hands in the air, describing the new stone walkway and how the Johnsons across the street were finally getting their driveway repaved. Dad nodded, staring at his plate, his fork moving food around but not eating. Ryan's glass was empty again and he reached for the bottle without looking at anyone. Sophie's phone buzzed, but she ignored it, eyes fixed on her water glass. I tried to focus on Mom's words, but they were just noise filling the space because no one wanted to face the silence. That was when Grandma Lydia set down her knife, the soft click loud in the quiet room. She wiped the corner of her mouth with her napkin, folded it carefully, and looked straight at me. "Emily," she said, her voice calm, "is the $2,000 I've been sending you every month enough to help you through this tough time?" The words didn't register at first. They floated above the table, landing softly before tearing everything apart. I blinked, trying to process what she had just said. "What?" I asked, my voice small, almost a whisper. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dad's hand shake as he tried to set his wine glass down. It slipped from his fingers, hitting the edge of his plate before crashing to the floor, red wine spreading across the tiles like a dark stain. Mom's face went pale, all the color draining so fast it was like watching paint wash away in the rain. Ryan stopped mid-pour, the liquid sloshing dangerously near the rim of his glass as he looked up, eyes wide. Sophie held her breath, her lips parted, her phone forgotten in her lap. I looked back at Grandma, my heart pounding in my chest so hard I could hear it. "What money, Grandma?" I asked again, louder, this time my voice shaking. Grandma didn't look at me. She turned her head slowly, her eyes landing on Mom with the kind of stare that could break you without a word. "Carol," Grandma said, her tone so cold it made the hair on my arms stand up. "Would you care to explain?" The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the drip of wine from the edge of the table, the shaky breath Dad let out as he bent to pick up the broken glass. Mom opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She closed it again, swallowing hard, her eyes darting to Dad, then to Ryan, then to me. I don't know what you mean, Mother," she finally managed, her voice thin and shaking. Grandma's lips pressed into a line as she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward Mom. "I have the bank statements," Grandma said, her voice steady. "I know exactly where the money has been going." Mom's hand trembled as she reached for the paper, but she didn't open it. Her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, her shoulders shaking as she tried to find the right words. "I can explain," Mom whispered, her voice breaking. Ryan let out a sharp breath, setting his glass down with a thud, the sound making Mom flinch. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at me, then at Mom, then back down at the table. I sat there frozen, my mind spinning, trying to understand what was happening, what this meant. I looked at Grandma, her eyes still on Mom, waiting. And in that moment, I realized my family had been hiding something from me, something big, something that was about to change everything I thought I knew about them. Mom's hands clenched around the paper, crumpling the edges, but she still didn't open it. Dad stood there with the towel wine dripping onto the tile as he looked at Mom with a pleading expression, silently begging her to say something, anything that would make this moment disappear. "Carol," Grandma said again, her voice low, calm, like a judge reading a verdict. "Explain to your daughter why she doesn't know I've been sending her money for 5 years." Mom's face twisted, her eyes, glassy tears finally spilling over as she shook her head. "It's not what you think," she choked out, looking at me, her eyes desperate. "Emily, we were trying to help you." "Help me," I said, my voice rising, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might get sick. "Help me how, Mom?" "By taking money that was meant for me while I've been working 2 jobs, eating ramen, and falling behind on rent." Mom sobbed, her shoulders shaking, but she didn't answer. Ryan stood, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape across the floor. "You took the money, didn't you?" he said, his voice cold, his eyes sharp. "You took Grandma's money and spent it on this house, this remodel, this show you keep putting on for everyone." Mom opened her mouth, but Ryan didn't give her the chance to speak. "While Emily was drowning," he snapped, pointing at me, "while Sophie was stressing over tuition, you were living it up." Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, tears running down her cheeks, her phone buzzing in her lap, ignored. "Is it true?" Sophie whispered, looking at Mom, her voice small, broken. Mom's sobs turned into gasps as she finally spoke. "We didn't steal," she cried out, her voice hoarse. "We needed it. We deserved it after everything we've done for you kids, after everything we sacrificed." I stared at her, feeling the world tilt, the room spinning as I tried to process what she had just said. "Deserved it," I repeated, my voice low, shaking. "You think you deserved money that wasn't yours while I was struggling to pay for groceries." Dad finally stepped forward, his voice shaking. "We were going to pay it back, Emily. We just needed time." Grandma's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension like glass shattering. "Time," she said, shaking her head. "You lied to me, to Emily, to your entire family, and for what? New furniture? A car you couldn't afford." Mom's sobs turned into angry tears. "You don't know what it's like, Mother," she snapped, her voice rising. "You've never had to worry about what people think, what the neighbors say. You've never had to live under someone else's shadow." Grandma stood slowly, her chair pushing back as she placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. "I built everything I have with your father, Carol," she said, her voice firm. "I worked, I sacrificed, I fought for every dollar we earned, and I never once lied to my family to keep up appearances." The room went silent, the weight of her words pressing down on all of us. I could hear Sophie crying softly, Ryan's heavy breathing, Dad's quiet apology that no one acknowledged. I looked at Mom, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw her for who she was. Not the mother who packed my lunches or kissed my forehead, but the woman who had stolen from me, who had chosen her pride over my future. Grandma turned to me, her eyes softening. "Emily," she said, "you deserve the truth now." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, forcing myself to stay calm. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking under the table. "I want to know exactly what you did." Mom's mouth opened, but no words came out, her eyes darting around the table as if looking for a way out. And that was when I knew. There was no way out. Have you ever discovered a betrayal that changed everything you thought you knew? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Money isn't just money. It's the years stolen from your life when you needed help the most. Grandma Lydia sat down again, folding her hands on the table, her eyes locked on Mom, who was still shaking, tears dripping onto the paper, crumpled in her hands. "I trusted you, Carol," Grandma said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. "And this is the price I pay for believing in you." Mom opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Grandma turned to me, her eyes softening for a moment. "Emily," she said, "I've been sending you $2,000 every month for the last 5 years. I was told you were sick, that you needed help to get through your medical bills while rebuilding your business." The words hit me like a slap. My ears rang as I tried to understand what she was saying. What I whispered, my throat dry. "I've never been sick, Grandma. I never saw a single dollar. Ryan's head snapped toward Mom, his eyes wide, anger rising. You told Grandma that Emily was sick. Ryan demanded, his voice cold. You took money meant for her and lied about her health. Mom's shoulders shook as she sobbed, her face hidden in her hands. Dad stepped forward, reaching out as if to comfort her, but she pulled away, clutching the paper tighter. I did it for the family. Mom choked out, her voice muffled. We were drowning and she needed help, and I thought it was the only way. The only way, I said, my voice shaking as I stood up, my chair scraping across the floor. While I was working 2 jobs, barely paying rent, skipping meals so I could pay off my loans, you were taking money meant for me to buy a new kitchen and a car. Sophie's eyes were wide, tears streaming down her cheeks as she shook her head. You told me I needed to drop out because it was too expensive, Sophie whispered, looking at Mom with betrayal in her eyes. All those nights I cried thinking I was ruining the family, and you had the money the whole time. Mom reached toward Sophie, but she pulled away, covering her mouth with her hand. Grandma pulled out another paper from her purse and placed it on the table. These are the trust documents, she said, her voice steady. The funds I set aside for each of my grandchildren's education. Ryan grabbed the papers, flipping through them, his eyes moving quickly. You took this too, he asked, looking at Mom, his voice rising with each word. You drained the trust funds. The down payment I was saving for my house, the money for Sophie's tuition, for Emily's college loans. Mom sobbed harder, her words coming out in a rush. We were going to pay it back, she cried. We just needed more time. Robert's job was unstable and we had bills and the credit cards, and you stole from your own children. Grandma interrupted, her voice like ice. Don't you dare call it anything else. Dad's hands were trembling as he wiped his forehead, his face pale. Mom, how could you? I asked, my voice breaking. All those nights I thought I was a failure, that I was the reason we were struggling, that I was the burden. Mom's face crumpled as she looked at me. You were never a burden, she sobbed. We couldn't keep up anymore. Ryan slammed the papers down on the table, the sound echoing in the room. You couldn't keep up with what, Mom? Ryan snapped. Your pride, the neighbors, your stupid image. Sophie was crying, her shoulders shaking, whispering, I can't believe this, over and over. Grandma sat silently, her eyes on Mom, waiting. And that was when Dad's voice broke through, low and shaking, as he looked at Grandma. If this gets out, Lydia, Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper, we'll lose everything. Dad's words hung in the air like smoke we couldn't clear. If this gets out, we'll lose everything. I turned to him, feeling heat rise in my face, anger flooding every nerve in my body. Lose everything. I repeated, my voice sharp. You mean the house you remodeled with money meant for our futures? The car sitting outside that I watched you drive while I was taking the bus to work every day? Dad's eyes fell to the floor, his shoulders slumping like all the air had gone out of him. Sophie wiped her tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. You told me we couldn't afford my classes, she said, her voice cracking. I almost dropped out. You made me feel guilty every time I talked about staying in school, and you had the money. Mom's sobs turned into harsh breaths as she tried to reach for Sophie. I thought it was best, Mom cried. I thought we would pay it back once we were stable. I didn't want you to get used to family money and feel entitled. Ryan let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. Entitled, he said, his voice low and furious. You stole from us and then told us we were the problem. Grandma Lydia stayed silent, but the way she looked at them made even me shiver. Calm, clear, and done with the excuses. I trusted you to handle these funds responsibly, Grandma said, her voice firm but quiet. I trusted you to care for your children, not to rob them of opportunities they deserved. Mom's hands dropped to her lap, the paper falling from her fingers, fluttering to the floor. We didn't mean to hurt them, Mom whispered, her voice small. But you did, I said, stepping closer, my voice steady, even as my hands shook. You hurt us every day you lied. Every day I worried about making rent, every time I skipped meals to save money, every time I felt like a failure because I couldn't get ahead. Ryan nodded, clenching his jaw. I worked 60-hour weeks in a job. I hate thinking it was the only way to make something of myself, Ryan said. All while you had the money to help and you chose not to. Sophie's shoulders shook as she wiped her tears again. I thought you were proud of me for working so hard, she whispered, looking at Mom, her eyes filled with hurt. I thought it mattered to you. Mom opened her mouth, but no words came out, only a soft cry that filled the space between us. Grandma's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. You will return what you can, Grandma said, her voice cold. You will not take another cent from me, and you will live with the consequences of your choices. Dad closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek, and when he opened them they looked empty. We'll lose everything, Dad repeated, but this time it was more to himself than to us. Grandma stood, taking a slow breath, her gaze moving around the table, stopping on me. Emily, she said, you and your siblings will not pay for their mistakes any longer, and in that moment I felt something inside me shift. For the first time I realized that everything I thought was stability, everything I thought was family had been built on a lie. And I wasn't sure what was left to save. What would you have done if you were me? Have you ever discovered a betrayal that changed everything? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The truth was out, but justice hadn't shown up yet. Ryan stood at the head of the table, his fists clenched, shaking with the kind of anger that comes from years of holding back. How long, Mom? Ryan demanded, his voice low but sharp. How long have you been stealing from us? Mom flinched, her eyes red, tears clinging to her lashes as she looked at him. It wasn't stealing, Mom said, her voice cracking. We did everything for you, for this family. We sacrificed everything. Sophie let out a sob, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried. You didn't sacrifice, I said, my voice calm but cold. You stole, you lied. You made us believe we were the problem while you were the ones destroying everything. Dad sat in the corner, staring at the floor, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Mom shook her head, her tears falling, now streaking her makeup down her cheeks. You don't understand, Mom said, her voice rising. The pressure, the looks from everyone when they see we're not keeping up, when they talk about vacations, renovations, new cars. You don't know what it's like to sit there and pretend like you're enough. Grandma Lydia shifted in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Mom. I know exactly what it's like, Carol, Grandma said, her voice quiet but strong. You think I had it easy, that I never had to fight for what I built with your father. You think I cared what the neighborhood said when I wore the same shoes for 5 years, working double shifts to keep the business alive. Mom's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I remember, Grandma continued, her eyes sharp. I remember you standing in my kitchen telling me you were tired of living in my shadow, that you wanted your own life, your own reputation, separate from me. Mom turned away, wiping her tears, her breathing heavy. You wanted to separate yourself, but you took my money to fund your image, Grandma said. You wanted the benefits without the work. Ryan stepped closer, leaning over the table. You took everything from us, Mom, Ryan said, his voice shaking with rage. Everything we worked for, everything we could have built, you took it because you were embarrassed. Sophie looked up, her face pale, her eyes red. I almost gave up on my dreams because of you. Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. I almost quit school because you made me feel guilty every time I asked for help. Mom covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Grandma reached into her purse, pulling out another envelope, placing it on the table with a quiet thud. I've had my lawyer look into the accounts, Grandma said. I know exactly what you've taken and how much you've lied. Dad looked up, his eyes wide, his face pale. Please, Lydia, Dad whispered, his voice hoarse. Please, if this gets out, we'll lose everything. We'll lose the house, the cars. We'll lose everything. Grandma didn't blink, her eyes cold as she looked at them. That is not my problem, Grandma said calmly. And in that moment, the silence was so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in around us. Dad's plea hung in the air, but Grandma didn't move, didn't soften. Mom dropped into her chair, burying her face in her hands, her cries muffled against her palms. We did it for the family, Mom sobbed. Everything we did to keep us together. No, I said, my voice steady, even as my hands shook at my sides. You did it for yourself. You did it to keep up with people who don't care about you while your own children suffered. Ryan stepped back from the table, running a hand through his hair, pacing near the window. You told me I needed to be a man to handle my own bills, to stop expecting handouts, Ryan said, his voice shaking. And you were sitting on money that was mine. Sophie wiped her eyes, her tears silent now, her voice small. I remember you telling me not to call Grandma for help, Sophie whispered. You said it would embarrass you. You said we needed to handle our own problems. Mom's shoulders shook harder, her sobs turning into small, sharp gasps. Dad closed his eyes, leaning against the wall, looking like he aged 10 years in a minute. Grandma took a breath, standing taller, her eyes scanning each of us. I have spoken to my attorney, Grandma said. If necessary, I will press charges for fraud and for the misuse of trust funds. Mom looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide. Mother, please, Mom whispered, her voice breaking. Please don't do this. You did this, Grandma said, her voice calm, her eyes sharp. You lied, you stole, you broke trust that can never be fully repaired. Dad pushed off the wall, dropping to his knees in front of Grandma. Lydia, please, Dad said, his voice cracking. We will lose everything. The bank is already calling the credit cards are maxed. We have nothing left. Grandma looked down at him, her face unreadable. That is not my concern, Grandma said softly. Dad's shoulders slumped, his head, dropping, his hands pressing against the floor as he started to cry. Mom reached for him, her cries mingling with his, the two of them shaking together on the floor, holding onto each other because there was nothing else left to hold onto. Sophie looked away, turning toward the window, her arms wrapped around herself. Ryan clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. I felt empty watching. The people who raised me crumble in front of me, a part of me wanting to comfort them, another part of me remembering every night I went to bed hungry every day. I sat in class exhausted from working, late every call, ignored because I couldn't afford help. Grandma's eyes met mine, her gaze softening for a moment. From now on, Grandma said, her voice clear, cutting through the sobs, all support I give will go directly to Emily, Ryan, and Sophie. She paused, letting the words sink in. It will not go through you again. The room went silent. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft whimpering of my parents, as they realized there was no way back from this. And in that silence, I knew everything had changed forever. Have you ever witnessed the people you trusted most fall apart right in front of you? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Karma doesn't miss anyone, even when they wear the title of parent. After that dinner, Grandma Lydia moved fast. She called her attorney the next morning, making sure every cent she intended for me, Ryan, and Sophie would go directly to us. No more middlemen. No more excuses. A week later, I woke up to a notification on my phone. A direct deposit from Grandma, enough to pay off the last of my student loans, enough to clear the debt that had been crushing me for years. I sat there on the edge of my bed, the morning light creeping through the blinds, letting the reality of it sink in. I was free. The weight I had carried on my shoulders since I was 18 was gone. I used the rest to buy new equipment for my design studio, replacing my old laptop with one that didn't overheat every hour, buying a camera I had only dreamed of owning, and putting down a deposit on a small studio space in a building downtown. The day I signed the lease, I called Ryan and he laughed, really laughed for the first time in years. I quit today, he said, his voice full of relief. I'm done with that corporate hellhole. I'm starting my own consulting firm. It's small, but it's mine. Sophie stayed in school, her shoulders lighter, her laughter returning as she stopped worrying about dropping out. She called me after her first week back in classes. I feel like I can finally breathe, and Sophie said, her voice bright. For the first time, I'm studying because I want to, not because I'm trying to prove something. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad's world fell apart. The bank repossessed the SUV first. I saw it when I drove past the house one morning, a tow truck pulling it away while Mom stood on the porch, clutching her robe, tears on her face. Then came the foreclosure notice taped to their door, bright red letters announcing what they tried so hard to hide. They sold the house within weeks, moving into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town. The living room windows faced a brick wall, and the only furniture they could take with them was what they could fit in the back of a borrowed truck. Mom called me one night, her voice quiet, almost small. Emily, she said, I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry. But there was something in her voice, a sharpness, a heaviness that didn't sound like real regret, more like regret that she got caught. I know, Mom, I said, and I meant it. I knew she was sorry, but not for the reasons I needed her to be. I moved out of their house and into my own apartment. It wasn't big, but it was mine. No more hearing Mom's passive-aggressive comments about how I wasn't trying hard enough. No more Dad silently watching while she picked at me for every decision I made. It was quiet in the mornings, the sun streaming through the kitchen window while I made coffee alone, but finally at peace. And that was when Adam showed up. He stood outside my studio one afternoon, hands in his pockets, his eyes tired, his hair messy like he had run his hands through it too many times before knocking. "Emily," he said, his voice soft, "can we talk?" I looked at him, the man who once said he couldn't handle my stress, who walked away when I needed him, standing there asking for another chance now that I had rebuilt myself. "No," I said, shaking my head, my voice steady. "I'm finally learning to love myself first." His shoulders dropped and he nodded, turning to leave without another word. I closed the studio door behind me, locking it, leaning back against it as I let out a long breath, feeling stronger than I had in years. A week later, I opened my mailbox and found a letter addressed to me in Mom's handwriting. "Have you ever had to choose yourself after years of choosing others? What would you have done if you were me?" Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. I stood in my kitchen, the letter from Mom trembling in my hands. The envelope was thin, her handwriting slanted across the front, my name written with the same careful loops she used on birthday cards when I was a child. I turned it over my thumb, hesitating at the flap, wondering if I was ready to read whatever excuse, whatever plea she had written inside. I tore it open anyway. "Dear Emily, I know I've hurt you. I know you don't trust me anymore, and maybe you never will. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand why I did what I did. We were drowning. The bills, the mortgage, the pressure to keep up, it all felt like it was swallowing me whole. I didn't know how to ask for help, not from you, not from your grandmother, not from anyone. Your father and I made mistakes, but we did it for the family. We did it for you and your siblings, to give you a home, to give you stability. I know it doesn't look that way now, but I need you to believe me. I miss you. I miss having you here, hearing your laugh, seeing you sit at the kitchen table while I made coffee. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to explain face to face. Please, Emily. Love, Mom." I read it twice, my hands shaking, my breath catching in my throat. The words blurred, anger and sadness swirling inside me, heavy in my chest. She still didn't get it. She still didn't see that the family she claimed to protect was the same family she had betrayed, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, until there was nothing left but silence and resentment. I set the letter down on the counter, pressing my palms against the cool surface, closing my eyes as I let out a slow breath. I thought about the nights I spent working until 2 in the morning, the cold walks home when I couldn't afford a lift, the weeks I skipped meals to make rent, the moments I almost called her for help but didn't because I knew what she would say. That I needed to figure it out on my own. That I needed to be strong. That it wasn't her problem. I looked around my small kitchen, the morning sun pouring through the window, the plants on the sill thriving in the light, the quiet peace of a space that was mine. Truly mine, paid for with my work, my sweat, my choices. My phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Sophie. "Are you okay?" I picked it up, staring at the screen for a moment before typing back. "I will be." I slipped the letter into a drawer, shutting it softly, letting the silence settle around me again. Mom wanted me to come back, to sit at the same table, to pretend like it could ever be the same again. But I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And as I stood there letting the morning air fill the room, I knew one thing for sure: karma was real. And sometimes it looked like a daughter finally choosing herself. Have you ever had to choose your own peace over family? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's a choice to set yourself free. I agreed to meet them at a small coffee shop on Hawthorne 1 with brick walls and mismatched chairs, a place that smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon scones. Mom was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. Dad sat next to her, quiet, his eyes on the floor, his shoulders hunched like the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. I took the seat across from them, folding my hands in my lap, waiting. Mom looked up at me, her eyes, red mascara smudged beneath them, her lips pressed together before she finally spoke. "Emily," she said, her voice shaking, "I don't know how to start." I didn't say anything. I waited. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over as she let out a shaky breath. I was so scared, Mom said, her voice cracking. Scared of falling behind, of people looking at us like we were nothing, like we were failures. Dad's hands tightened around his cup, the paper crumpling under his grip. I thought if we could just keep up, Mom continued, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, if we could look like we were okay, then maybe everything would be okay. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. I didn't want you to see us as weak, she whispered. I didn't want you to feel ashamed of us. Dad finally looked up, his eyes tired, sunken. She's right, Dad said, his voice low, rough. But it doesn't excuse what we did. We took what wasn't ours. We hurt you, we know that. I swallowed, the coffee shop sounds fading around me, replaced by the quiet thud of my heart in my chest. I understand why you did it, I said, my voice calm even. But understanding isn't the same as forgiving. Mom let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. Dad reached for her, pulling her into his side, holding her as she cried. I'm sorry, Emily, Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wish we could give it all back, but we can't. I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment, the heaviness of everything we'd lost, everything they'd stolen. I don't expect you to pay it back, I said quietly. I don't expect anything from you anymore. Mom looked up, her face crumpled, her eyes desperate. Does that mean you forgive us? She asked. I paused, taking a deep breath, letting it out slowly. No, I said, shaking my head. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I don't hate you. Her face fell, but she nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I needed to hear that, she whispered. I stood, pulling my coat around me, looking at them one last time before I left. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me, filling my lungs, reminding me that I was alive, that I was free, that I was allowed to keep moving forward. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Grandma Lydia. You don't owe them anything, Emily, she said when I answered, her voice steady, warm. I know, I replied, looking up at the gray Portland sky, letting the drizzle land on my face, washing away the last pieces of guilt I didn't need to carry anymore. And for the first time, I believed it. I walked home from that coffee shop with the cold air biting at my face. Every step felt like I was leaving another piece of the past behind me on that rain-slicked Portland sidewalk. I didn't look back. When I got home, I hung my coat, made tea, and sat at my small kitchen table. I let the warmth of the cup in my hands remind me that I was safe, that I was allowed to choose myself. The next morning, I opened my studio early, the sun barely peeking over the city rooftops. I turned on the lights, letting them flood over the white walls, the new equipment Grandma helped me buy humming softly as it warmed up. I had a list of clients waiting, but I wasn't in a rush. I took a breath, pulling out my sketchbook, letting the lines come naturally as I sipped coffee, the steam rising in the quiet room. By noon, I walked down the block to the community center where I had agreed to teach a small design class on weekends. Most of the students were women who wanted to start small businesses. Some were teenagers looking for a creative outlet. Some were older, rebuilding themselves just like I had. I watched them as they learned, their faces lighting up when they finally figured out a tool or finished a project. It made me feel alive, like the struggle hadn't been wasted, like all of it was worth something. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by the studio. He was 35, a photographer who shot mostly for small businesses and local artists, capturing them in their element, finding beauty in small things. Hey, he said, holding 2 cups of coffee in his hands, his brown hair messy under a beanie, his smile warm. Hey, I said, taking the cup he offered, letting my fingers brush against his for just a moment. We sat on the floor of my studio, leaning against the wall, the sunlight hitting the concrete in soft patches. I've been thinking, he said, his eyes on the steam rising from his cup. You're doing something incredible here, Emily. I looked at him, the way his eyes were gentle, the way he didn't flinch from my past, the way he didn't try to fix me. I'm trying, I said, quietly. You're more than trying, he said, turning to look at me. You're living. I smiled, a small, real smile that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside. We talked about nothing and everything, about the clients I was taking, about his last photo shoot, about the best taco truck in the city. It was easy, natural, and I realized how different this was from what I had before. I didn't need him to complete me. I didn't need him to fix me. I just liked who I was when I was around him. That night, I walked back to my apartment alone, the streetlights glowing the city alive around me, and I felt like I was finally breathing. When I got home, there was a voicemail from Grandma Lydia. "Emily," she said, her voice calm but serious, "I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else." I sank into the couch, clutching my phone as I listened. "Your father was admitted to the hospital this afternoon. Stress, they think. He's stable, but I thought you should know." She paused, her voice softening. "Do you want to go see him?" I stared at the dark ceiling, the city noises outside the window, my breath catching in my throat, because in that moment, I realized I had a choice to make. Have you ever had to decide between protecting your peace or answering a call from your past? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. I lost a family, but I found myself. I walked into the hospital the next morning, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air, the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum reminding me I didn't belong here anymore. I found Mom sitting in a stiff plastic chair outside Dad's room, her hands twisting a tissue that was already falling apart. She looked up when she saw me, her eyes red, her shoulders hunched like the weight of the world was pressing her down. "Emily," she said, her voice cracking. I nodded but didn't move to hug her. I didn't sit. I stood there, holding my bag tightly, letting the silence stretch between us. "He's stable," she whispered, glancing at the closed door. "They said it was stress. I think it's everything." I took a breath, letting it fill my lungs before I let it out slowly. "I don't hate you," I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. "But I can't trust you anymore." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks, her hands covering her mouth as she sobbed. "I'm sorry," she cried, the words muffled. "I'm so sorry." I stood there, letting her words hang in the air, letting the moment exist without rushing to fix it, without rushing to comfort her. "I know," I said finally. "But that doesn't change what happened." She looked up at me, her eyes begging for something I couldn't give. Dad's nurse opened the door, poking her head out, giving us a soft smile. "You can go in," she said. I stepped past Mom, pushing the door open, the quiet beep of the monitors greeting me as I walked in. Dad lay in the bed, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his hair messy, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes tired as they met mine. "Emily," he said, his voice raspy. I stood at the foot of the bed, my arms crossed, watching him. "I'm glad you came," he said. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I needed to say it to you too," I said quietly. "I don't hate you, Dad. But I don't trust you." His eyes closed for a moment, a tear slipping down his cheek before he opened them again. "I understand," he whispered. "I'm sorry." I nodded again, taking one last look at him before turning to leave. As I stepped out of the room, I felt lighter, like a weight I didn't know I was still carrying had finally been lifted. I walked past Mom without stopping, pushing open the doors to the parking lot, the cold morning air hitting me, waking me up, reminding me that I was alive, that I was allowed to move forward. And I did. The day after the hospital, Grandma Lydia called and asked if I could come over. When I arrived, the house smelled like cinnamon and coffee, the warm scent wrapping around me as I stepped inside. She was in the kitchen, her silver hair pinned back, wearing a soft blue sweater that made her look even stronger somehow. "I'm glad you came," Grandma said, giving me a small, knowing smile. I nodded, slipping off my coat, letting the warmth of her home sink into me. "I thought it was time for a real family dinner," she said. In the dining room, the table was set with simple white plates, candles flickering, soft music playing in the background. Ryan was already there helping Sophie with the drinks, and Daniel stood near the window, his camera bag at his feet, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Hey," Daniel said, giving me that soft smile that never made me feel small. "Hey," I replied, feeling something warm bloom in my chest. We sat down, the five of us, Grandma, Ryan, Sophie, Daniel, and me. No pretending, no heavy secrets sitting between us, no expectations we couldn't carry. Grandma raised her glass, her eyes moving around the table, stopping on each of us. "To a new family," she said. We clinked glasses, the sound soft, real, echoing in the quiet room. As we ate, we talked about small things, real things, about Sophie's classes, about Ryan's new clients, about the photo project Daniel was working on, capturing small businesses around Portland. I told them about the class I was teaching, about the women who were learning to design their own logos, about the teenager who stayed late to practice because it was the only place she felt safe. Sounds like you're changing lives, Daniel said, his eyes warm proud. Maybe, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. But I think they're changing mine too. After dinner, we moved to the living room, the lights low, the rain tapping softly against the windows. I sat next to Grandma, leaning into her as she rested her hand over mine. I'm proud of you, Emily, she said quietly. I'm trying, I replied. You're living, she corrected, her eyes twinkling. We sat there, the others laughing softly across the room. Daniel looking over at me with that steady gaze that didn't demand anything, that only offered comfort. In that moment, I realized I had built something real, something honest, something that wasn't tangled up in lies or stolen money. I had found a family again, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose, the one that chose me. The next morning, I opened my studio early, the light pouring in through the big windows, catching on the plants I had lined up on the sill. I brewed coffee, letting the smell fill the space, letting the peace of the moment settle around me. I turned on my laptop, the screen lighting up with projects waiting, clients needing edits, a class to prepare for the weekend. I took a breath, letting it out slowly, a small smile on my face as I looked around the space I built for myself. I was okay. I was more than okay. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most, what would you have done? Have you ever had to let go of your past to build a future that's truly yours? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice, healing, and quiet revenge.